The Cold War was a conflict between the United States and Soviet Union after World War II. This video will cover two American history content statements. The first content statement is statement number 24, the Second Red Scare and McCarthyism, reflected Cold War fears in American society. The Cold War was a rivalry between the United States and Soviet Union from 1945 to 1991. It was not a real war, but a conflict that had the potential to turn into a real war. It was led by the world's two atomic-powered superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. Each had nuclear weapons and a number of allies. All blue countries on the map were on America's side, and the red countries were on the Soviet Union side. The fear was that at any moment, an event could happen that turned this conflict from a Cold War into a hot war that involved actual fighting, possibly even using nuclear bombs, and potentially the end of humanity as we know it. The Second Red Scare. The communists were known as the Reds, going back to the Russian Revolution in 1917. In the late 19-teens and early 1920s, there was a Red Scare in America as people feared communism would expand into America. In the 1940s and 1950s, after World War II, there was a second Red Scare in America. The communist Soviet Union was gaining power in Eastern Europe during this time, and communism expanded in Asia, which led to this Red Scare or fear of communism. Because of the fear of communism, civil liberties were lost for some Americans, as the alleged threat of communism was more important to many than treating someone as innocent until proven guilty or respecting the different views of a person. The Second Red Scare focused attention on the media, labor unions, universities, and the military as targets of communist subversion or places where communism was spreading. Wisconsin Senator Joseph McCarthy gained national fame with a speech he gave in Wheeling, West Virginia on February 9, 1950. Every year on Lincoln's birthday, Republican organizations around the country hold dinners with speeches honoring Abraham Lincoln, the most famous and successful Republican president in history. Joseph McCarthy was a speaker at one such event in Wheeling, West Virginia, as he was a Republican senator from Wisconsin. You may know where Wheeling, West Virginia is, or have even been there, but it's probably not the place you would expect the Republicans to send their most influential speaker to. At the time, McCarthy was a struggling, no-name first-term senator, likely to lose his re-election attempt, who took this opportunity to give a speech claiming he had a list of over 200 names of communists working in the American government. Over the next few days, news of this accusation spread. He became a well-known national name. Continued accusations and investigations into communism in America, mostly unfounded and false, kept McCarthy's name in the news and made him one of the most prominent politicians in the country. He realized he could use TV to get people's attention and make a name for himself. He is someone who today would have loved Twitter. In 1954, as his popularity was decreasing, he attempted to call the army soft on communism in television hearings. The hearings went terribly for McCarthy, and he was exposed to the nation as a bully and a liar. Like Joseph McCarthy in the Senate, the House of Representatives created the House Un-American Activities Committee, or HUAC, to investigate threats of communism in American government and society. Like McCarthy, the HUAC did not consider people's rights. As the political cartoon showed, the HUAC wanted to find communism, and any damage it did to innocent civilians was deemed just part of the process. One effect of being called a communist was being blacklisted. Blacklisting was when, due to being accused of being a communist, whether correctly or incorrectly, a person may end up being blacklisted or denied employment in their career of choice. Many actors and directors would be blacklisted and unable to get a job in Hollywood over accusations that they were communist. The next content statement is number 25. The Cold War and its conflicts in Korea and Vietnam influenced domestic and international politics. The Cold War dominated international politics and impacted domestic policies in the United States for 45 years. There were many examples of this. The Second Red Scare, or fear of communists, that was mentioned earlier, is one example. Another example is the nuclear arms race between the United States and Soviet Union as the U.S. tried to continue building and testing more powerful nuclear weapons to maintain an advantage over the Soviet Union. Also, the role of the United Nations, which the U.S. was part of, expanded as America attempted to keep communism from spreading throughout the world. After World War II, the Korean Peninsula in Asia was split into Communist North Korea and Democratic South Korea. The map on the right shows the change in territory throughout the war. The green territory is controlled by South Korea, and the red territory is controlled by North Korea. To the north of North Korea is Communist China. This war lasted from 1950 to 1953, but most fighting ended in 1951. It just would take 2 years of negotiating to end the active fighting, although an official peace treaty was never signed. Because of the Truman Doctrine, the U.S. pledged to protect any nation threatened by communism. When North Korea invaded South Korea, we sent troops to South Korea to help and push North Korea back, as you can see on the map, almost taking control of all of North Korea in the process as shown by the map. However, as America and the United Nations troops approached the border of China, Communist China joined the fighting, and the two sides were pushed back to essentially the original border. As I said, there was never a peace treaty ending the war, but the fighting ended with North and South Korea still divided. To this day, the threat of war breaking out between North and South Korea is still there. However, a positive from the Korean War was improved relationship between the United States and Japan, who was our enemy during World War II. Cuba is only 90 miles south of Florida. In 1959, Fidel Castro led a communist takeover of Cuba. The American government did not want to see communism expand anywhere in the world as part of the containment policy, but was especially worried about a nation so close to the United States becoming communist. That led to the Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961. The American CIA organized a failed invasion of Cuba. The plan had Cuban exiles, or people who left Cuba after the communist takeover, return and invade Cuba and try to overthrow the communist forces using weaponry supplied by the United States. The failure of this invasion was embarrassing for America, but also angered Castro and led to a closer relationship between Cuba and the Soviet Union. This relationship led to, in October 1962, when U.S. intelligence found that the Soviet Union had placed nuclear missiles in Cuba. These missiles, if launched, could hit almost anywhere in the United States. For 13 days, there was a very real fear that nuclear war was about to break out. The U.S. government had to decide, should the U.S. attack Cuba, but risk one or more missiles being launched before all could be disabled, or attempt to negotiate for their removal and leave and if that failed, all the missiles would still be placed in Cuba. Eventually, cooler heads prevailed, and the Soviet missiles were removed. However, this event was the closest the world ever came to nuclear war. America became involved in Vietnam as far back as 1955, but full-scale American military involvement began in 1964. Like the Korean War, this was an example of the Truman Doctrine in action. The U.S. government sent troops to help Democratic South Vietnam in a war with Communist North Vietnam. The U.S. fought in Vietnam until 1973, and the war still wasn't won. After America left, the North Vietnamese defeated our ally South Vietnam in 1975. The Vietnam War lasted a long time. Over 58,000 American soldiers were killed. It was also very expensive and became more unpopular each year of the fighting. One reason for this unpopularity was the fact that TVs were common in most homes, and each night news reports showed the terrible toll this war was taking on Americans. And sometimes news reports contradicted what government officials were saying. The war divided the country and sparked massive protests throughout America. Anti-war protests sometimes turned violent. The most notorious incident was at nearby Kent State University when on May 4th, 1970, 4 college students were killed by National Guard troops. The Vietnam War, which many felt was unwinnable, started because of American Cold War policy, but changed our country and the way we view government forever.